Yeah, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. John and Colette just mentioned some of the risks that we face when the balanced approach is not followed, as is agreed by ICAO and the member states. One of these risks is permanent capacity reductions, as we've seen in Amsterdam and elsewhere. And so I'd like to talk to you a little bit more in detail about those today as to why capacity reductions and the resulting loss of historic slots that come with them are so harmful to customers, the aviation industry, and the economy as a whole. For the reasons I'll explain, IATA is completely opposed to permanent capacity reductions and urges regulators, airports, and other stakeholders to work with the airlines to identify more refined and efficient solutions to any perceived problems. And if you'll permit me, I'd like to start with a slide just on the basics of airport slots as a reminder. You'll see at the top of the slide there, you've got the definition of an airport slot. As this indicates, these are planning tools. They are issued in advance in order to help organize the schedule well before the actual on-the-day operations. Not every airport even requires airport slots. Only what we call level 3 airports or highly congested airports are constrained to the point where slots are even a necessary planning tool. And while all carriers at one of those level 3 airports do have to have a slot in order to operate, it's important not to confuse airport slots and ATC slots. ATC slots are the on-the-day tool that are used once we move out of the planning stage and into the operational. So if you're sitting on the runway and the pilot says, okay, we're about to take off in 10 minutes because we've been granted an earlier slot, they're talking about the ATC slot. Throughout the presentation, I may refer to just slots. So that's a reminder, today we're talking about airport slots, not the on-the-day ATC slots. Airport slot allocation is managed by independent coordinators in order to provide a neutral, non-discriminatory, and fair access to all airlines. And at its heart, the fundamental principle of the airport slot system is historic slot rights. This concept is sometimes referred to as the use it or lose it principle and is included in the worldwide airport slot guidelines that are agreed by airports, coordinators, and airlines as the global best practice and are included in every slot regulation for level 3 airports around the world today. These regulations in their various forms create a property right of the airline in the historic slot as long as it is operated to the required levels. This ensures that that same slot can then be returned to the airline in the following year. Historic slots provide the foundation for the global network schedule that we all rely on. For example, as you see in this chart, 43% of all passengers pass through a level 3 airport, including most of you, I assume, because Geneva is a level 3 airport. As the other stats on this slide indicate, this is a globally prevalent system, which we have referred to often as the unsung hero of the air traffic network. And whether you look on a micro or a macro basis, historic slots provide the certainty needed to ensure the value of aviation. And I'd like to take a bit deeper dive into that over the next few minutes and the next few slides. I'll start by zooming in on the customer and then pull back to look at the aviation industry and then finally to the economy as a whole. So looking at the customer, since the creation of the slot system and the very concept of a historic slot, people have been able to fly more efficiently at a lower cost to more places than ever before. This chart on the slide shows the growth in connectivity, in blue, versus the real price of air transport in red over slightly more than 2 decades. We know that customers demand choice and want it at the best possible price. This connectivity and cost competitiveness have been delivered through the slot system. Historic slots allow airlines to invest in new routes by providing them with the security that their investment will be allowed to continue from year to year. Similarly, we all rely as customers on the certainty of airline schedules and these city pair links. People need to know that they'll be able to timely obtain the materials they need to fulfill their contracts, to visit friends and family abroad, and more broadly, to have access to the rest of the world. If capacity is reduced, as is being threatened in some areas, and historic slots are then removed, this connectivity will be lost. Vital links between communities will be broken, and this will prevent people from engaging in trade, tourism, and travel. The same then applies if we zoom out a bit to look at the aviation industry. Competition is vital to any healthy industry, and certainly it's alive and well in aviation. As this chart shows on the slide, the share of single carrier routes in the EU has decreased from 72 to 65% over the last decade, providing competition on more routes, which then drives innovation and the lower costs that we saw on the previous slide. This competition isn't just seen on the route level either. According to ACI Europe's stats, between 2009 and 2019, low-cost carriers grew 135.6%, while full-service carriers actually declined by 7%. And all of this is in Europe, which has about half of the world's slot-constrained airports. So historic slots can enable this competition by giving new entrants the base they need to compete at congested airports and ultimately move from new entrant status to powerful incumbents in their own right. If you were to look out the window, you'd probably see more EasyJet planes here than any other, as they've proven adept in using the historic slot system to expand their network and provide this competition at airports like Geneva. We've seen similar success elsewhere from the likes of Hong Kong Express, Jetstar, Fly-Dubai, and others. And I mentioned those four in particular. They're not only beneficiaries of the historic slot system, but they're also among its strongest advocates. They're all members of our airline slot policy working group, and for EasyJet and Hong Kong Express, they are also members of the Joint Airline Coordinator and Airport Worldwide Airport Slot Board, which is responsible for writing the slot guidelines. So as these airlines and others well know, their success would not be possible without these historic slots, which again provide them with a legal entitlement to continue operating their services year on year. From their bases in level 3 airports such as Gatwick, Hong Kong, and Dubai, they're able to increase competition and expand into new markets thanks to historic slots. And as we've seen from the concerns raised by the US government, JetBlue, and others as to Amsterdam, reducing capacity reverses this process. It removes historic slots from the airlines who need that access to compete, and perhaps more importantly, it renders it impossible for new entrants to come into the system and earn these historic rights themselves. This ultimately cuts competition, reduces choice, and harms the industry. And then finally, on a macroeconomic scale, I think it's pretty clear air transport is vital for the modern economy as a whole. In addition to its direct role as an employer, it also serves as a virtual bridge between cities, generating the flows of trade, investment, people, competition, and the exchange of ideas, which are the building blocks of economic development. If you look just at the Netherlands on this slide, in light of the ongoing discussion about Amsterdam, you can see this reflected in the value of aviation chart we created in 2019, showing 306,000 jobs created and 25 billion in added GDP supported by air transport and tourists arriving by air. If you zoomed out and looked at those numbers on a global view, those numbers would be 87.7 million jobs and 3.5 trillion with a T added GDP. These values are the net result of the benefits of the slot process, which I've discussed in the previous slides: customer choice, connectivity, and competition. Now, thankfully, most governments worldwide see and appreciate this value and support the slot system. But unfortunately, in a few countries, the value of the slot process is under attack. Permanent capacity reductions, such as we've seen in Amsterdam and Mexico City, and now threatened in Bogota, put historic slots and the entire slots process at risk. And to be clear, IATA is completely opposed to these types of permanent capacity reductions. If we look at the example of the Netherlands that Colette already kind of mentioned, we can see how poorly this goes when the process isn't followed. Because historic slots are a legally protected right in the EU slot regulation, like most others, it is likely that these individual carriers were planning to sue following the removal of their historic slots because of these reductions. Further, there is no process in the EU slot regs, in the WASG, or anywhere else to cover how historic slots are supposed to be removed, in what proportion, from what airline, and under what kind of protection if ultimately that capacity were to come back in the future. This forced the Dutch coordinator in the Amsterdam case to invent a process out of whole cloth, which again could have been subject to legal challenge had the situation remained unchanged. And not only did the airlines there face the loss of historic slots, but also the reduction in capacity made it impossible to allocate any slots to new entrants, such as JetBlue, defeating one of the most valuable parts of the slot process and threatening competition. So because of all of these concerns, and as you probably know, first the Dutch courts were asked to intervene in a various series of lawsuits, and then ultimately and recently the US government submitted that these reductions violated the Open Skies Agreement between the countries, and the European Commission got involved and wrote to the Dutch government advising that these reductions were likely in violation of the balanced approach as it is enshrined in EU law, as John and Colette have described. And thankfully, all of this noise kind of together finally caused the Dutch government to see the light and at least temporarily suspend these reductions. But we would have expected further litigation had this not been the case. Unfortunately, we can't even rest easy on the Amsterdam file, however. Surprisingly, as you may have seen, Schiphol Airport expressed its disappointment with the suspension of the reductions. They've also recently suggested that capacity will not be able to return to last year's levels despite the suspension, claiming that ATC, border control, and other staffing shortfalls will prevent the airport from delivering its past historical capacity. These concerns were not raised when they initially declared capacity in September of this year, and we're very worried earlier this week in a coordination committee meeting to hear that they couldn't even guarantee a minimum level of service equal to that they'd already declared in September under the now suspended reductions. This is a very troubling position, which raises concerns as to whether the airport or the Dutch government is intentionally trying to drive down capacity to accomplish these reductions through other means. We could therefore still see the loss of historics at Amsterdam despite the suspension, along with all of the drawbacks that this entails for the passengers, the aviation industry, and the economy as a whole. We therefore call on governments and airports to work with the airlines rather than against them in finding solutions to capacity concerns which maintain the critical value of the slot process as I've described, and of aviation as a whole to their citizens, their economy, and their customers. And before I conclude, I'd also like to briefly acknowledge the recent opening of the UK slot regulation for consultation and possible amendment. As I believe was said this morning, we welcome this opportunity to work with the UK government on slots. The current slot rules have helped the UK develop into one of the world's most competitive and connected air transport markets. The worldwide airport slot guidelines are certainly a living document that is constantly amended through the hard work of the airlines, the airports, and the coordinators. And it would be good for the UK to take this opportunity to more fully align with the changes that we've made over the past few years and remain part of the coordinated and harmonized global system. And then finally, I'd like to leave you with a few additional resources in case you'd like to know more about the airport slots world. We've recently released a special supplement on slots in the Airline magazine, which I believe may be on some of the tables in front of you, as well as the documentary video providing a deep dive into the slots process, which was filmed over the course of a few days during this year's June slot conference. And I think the documentary may be shown later in the day as well. These are available from the links on our slot page on our website, but I've also provided the shortened links there on the slide if it's easier for your reference.